Let me just go back a little bit and explain in a little more detail psychoanalysis and Freud, because what we're going to do is we're going to set the stage for where psychiatry was, and it happened to be just about the time when I was going through my training, before we transitioned from a psychoanalytic model to a medical model. And you can't understand what psychiatry has become if you don't understand that history. So when I was in training in the early 1960s, the psychoanalytic model still predominated in psychiatric training programs. Most of the heads of departments of psychiatry, including where I was at the University of Colorado, were psychoanalysts, that is, psychiatrists who, after the training that I was getting, went on to psychoanalytic training, where they learned the methods of Freudian analysis and did a kind of therapy model, which I will explain in a minute. And it was that model which gradually began to be rather frowned upon more and more by the medical community and by some people in psychiatry. And there were political forces and economic changes, which I will be describing, which was putting the pressure on psychiatry. So that's why I want to tell you a little more about, well, what was the pre-existing model? Sigmund Freud was a neurologist. Obviously, he was an MD, a Viennese, and he was a very energetic young physician trying to make a go of it for himself. And at that time in European history, one of the patterns of behavioral disturbance that was very noted was what they called hysteria. And we can't really get off into a lot of details about how that all developed, but women were considered to have a disorder which was causing some of the behaviors which were noted by doctors and families, like fainting spells or behaviors or in sexual life which were maybe not condoned, or other kinds of apparent medical disorders which no one could explain. And there was another neurologist, Charcot, who worked in Paris and was developing a reputation for treating women with those kind of problems. And Freud went to study. And out of that, Freud began to develop his own ideas about how to work with these patients. And he eventually developed a model for talking with them or listening to them and then interpreting and explaining what they were saying to him in a method which was supposed to help them resolve their problems and change the behaviors so that whatever was the presenting problem would go away. And it's a little far afield for me to try to go into it in greater detail, but in essence, Freudian analysis was the model that he developed in which he had certain theories which could explain why these patients had the problems that they had, these behavioral symptoms that they were exhibiting. It's a time when hypnosis was being used by a variety of medical physicians, and Freud was one of the people, but he eventually did not go that way. So psychiatry had moved in the direction of this psychoanalytic model more in America than it had in Europe. It's kind of ironic. Freud did come to the United States for one visit, didn't like it here at all, but his influence somehow caught on in America. So that at the time that I was a trainee in the late 60s, Freudian analysis was more popular in America. The medical model was much more prevalent in Europe. They did more prescribing of drugs and electric shock treatment and other physical treatments of patients, mostly in hospitals, than in America. Now, the way Freudian analysis worked, once it had caught on, you might say, it was really therapy for the well-to-do. Hollywood movie stars and other people of wealth might go to an analyst because these sessions would be 3, 4, 5 times a week. The patient, in a method that Freud developed, did not sit and look at the therapist. They were lying on the couch. We all know about that model. The therapist would be behind them taking notes and eventually would make very, very selective interpretations. But Freud had a certain set of ideas that in the end he promoted. Ideas like all conditions which were less severe than major psychotic breakdowns, what had been starting to be called schizophrenia, but something less severe than that, where people were outliving their life in society, but had different kinds of problems, he was saying they all came down to a common pattern, that you haven't resolved your Oedipus complex. We've all heard about that as well. And the purpose of the therapy was to resolve the Oedipus complex. That is, the desire to exclude this parent of the same sex in order to have a relationship with the parent of the opposite sex, which was a total relationship to satisfy all of your psychological needs. So, and in his many, many articles, Freud was a very prolific writer, and now I'm shifting to the things that I concluded as a beginning psychiatric trainee. He had concocted a series of explanations which was truly fantastic. It kind of reminded me of those cartoons that you might see of a kind of a Rube Goldberg machine where fluid was going into this tube, into a valve, and that was turning a wheel, and the wheel was tilting a beaker with some fluid flow in another valve, and by the end you get some kind of buzz, some sort of rotating something. Because he would talk about libido being dammed up here and aggression being diverted there, and it just struck me as fantastic and ridiculous. And that was my attitude in my training, that I wasn't shy about it, I didn't accept it, but I did accept certain key features of what Freud was promoting or saying, and I still believe in them to this day. The importance of the unconscious, the critical nature of childhood development and relationships, and very important is the understanding of internal conflict. That is, that you couldn't just you didn't have to have just one feeling about a subject. You could have at least a couple, if not more. You could feel different ways about the same people or different subjects, but you might be less aware of them. Forces inside of you might be acting that you didn't really have a handle on. That part I did accept. So that was the state of psychiatry as far as working with people who were not in hospitals, and the place of Freud. Department heads were psychoanalysts. But a beginning movement was starting to develop of psychiatrists who were saying, if we do not change our ways, now we're talking about the mid to late 60s now, if we do not do something different, there are forces growing in which we are going to be aced out. They wouldn't say it that way, but we need to get back in the medical community. I remember this as though it was yesterday. We need to put our stethoscopes back in our pockets, in our lab coats, because people were challenging the idea that psychotherapy even worked. How do you prove that psychotherapy works? So that's where the battle was the gloves were dropped. The challenge was put down. Are you going to be real doctors, or the psychotherapists who are not medical doctors? They can do it better, as well as you can, maybe, and they don't cost as much money. And psychiatry responded. And boy, did they respond. And we're paying the price right now in many, many ways. And that's where we're going to go next. is we're going to talk about how psychiatry responded and how they collaborated, and I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way. The result's the same. How they cooperated with other forces in government, in industry, of course, especially the pharmaceutical industry, and in the main political organizations representing psychiatrists, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, how they all came together to change psychiatry for the worse, in my opinion, and how we desperately need, as a society, to reevaluate the changes that took place.